With the winter meetings wrapped up and the Rangers roster mostly in place, is this team, as currently constructed, good enough to contend for a playoff spot? I'm getting into all of that and more on this episode of Locked On Rangers. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Rangers, your daily Texas Rangers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are locked onto the Texas Rangers. I'm Bryce Patrick, a cripplingly addicted Texas Rangers fan since 2010, the founder and host for all 4 seasons of this Locked On Rangers podcast. Thank you all so much for making Locked On Rangers your first listen every single day. If you're not already, you can follow me on Twitter at Bryce Patrick. You can follow the show at Locked On Rangers and subscribe on YouTube, where the best way you can help grow the show is to comment any single thing below. Now, the Rangers made 2 very big moves in signing Jake deGrom and also signing Andrew Heaney. There has not been a whole lot else going on. They lost a player to the Rule 5 draft. They also DFA'd a player, the final player in the Yu Darvish trade, AJ Alexy, to make room on the 40-man for Andrew Heaney. So the Rangers roster for now is set. I think there might be some moves coming. I would like to see some moves coming, but I also wanted to look at where this team is right now and how it stacks up with some of the other playoff teams and how they stack up even compared to last year. Let's take a look at a roster where they are establishing kind of a baseline. Last year, they finished with 94 losses, but I'm going with their Pythagorean record according to Baseball Reference, because I feel like that's more indicative of where this team is as of last year. They had a Pythagorean record of 77 wins and 85 losses. So to get into the playoffs, last year, the worst team had a 86-76 record. That was the Tampa Bay Rays. That's kind of about where the Rangers are clawing for. So they needed to add, let's do that math. 9-ish wins from 9 wins. Okay, yes, 9 wins from where they were last year. Let's take a look at the biggest addition in Jacob deGrom. That is about a 5-ish win player. I think, let's just look at the roster and where it would be as of right now, the opening day lineup. I think it would start with Marcus Semien at second, Corey Seager at short, Nathaniel Lowe at first base batting cleanup and DHing Mitch Garver. In right field, Adolis Garcia hitting 5th, and hitting 6th at third is Josh Young, Jonah Heim catching, hitting 7th. In center field, Leody Taveras, and in the 9th spot in left field is Bubba Thompson. The bench at this point, I think, would be Josh Smith, Mark Mathias, and Brad Miller. Maybe Sam Huff in there. I know I don't feel great about the Brad Miller addition, but he's got a guaranteed contract next year, and as of this point, I haven't heard any rumblings about them moving on from him. I think eventually they probably will, because he had such a terrible season. I think injuries play a little bit of a part to it as well. He had some stretches at the beginning of the year where he was pretty healthy and contributing, but I don't know how much I'm going to count on that for next year as a guy who is only getting older, going to be 32 next season. Did play in 81 games this year, but was just honestly pretty horrendous after a really good month of May for the rest of the season. Now, the starting rotation at this point, I think, looks like this. Jacob deGrom at number 1, Martin Perez, number 2, John Gray, Andrew Heaney, and Jake Odorizzi for some depth. You've got Dane Dunning there if you need it, but that's 17 names on this roster at this point, which leaves space for an 8-man bullpen, which I think is fine. I think that's fine. Actually, that'd be 9. Okay, so let's put Sam Huff in there. Let's put Sam Huff on this roster, because it is 26-man roster. My brain still isn't quite processing that's how all this works, coming off of this being the first, I think, second full season. I don't know. It hasn't been very long that there have been 26 as opposed to 25-man rosters. Anyway, that's an 8-man bullpen that looks like this. Jose Leclerc as your closer, Jonathan Hernandez and Brock Burke as kind of the setup guys, Taylor Hearn, Joe Barlow as kind of the next guys on the roster, on the bullpen, and the bottom 3 is kind of filled out by Brett Martin, John King, and Josh Spores. And as this stands, I think for the most part, it's a pretty decent roster. You look at all 3 of the main, I guess 4 of the main components, and it's pretty good. The lineup, the top 3 is obviously really solid. That middle third of the lineup, I really really like. The bottom third is, I think, fine. Jonah Heim, it depends on what kind of Jonah Heim we're getting. If we're getting first half pre All-Star break Jonah Heim, that's a really really good lineup, and he might end up hitting ahead of Josh Young for a little bit. Leody Taveras, if he can just be average, I think I'd prefer him in kind of the number 9 slot. But both of these guys, at the 8 and 9, the least offensive players on this Rangers starting lineup, I think both of them would be okay in that kind of 8-9, turning the lineup over, getting on base, causing havoc on the base paths. And if you start your inning with number 9 and Leody or Bubba gets on base, and then you have Marcus Semien batting with one of those guys that steals and gets the runners in scoring position, that would be a really nice way to set up your lineup. I do think that there could be Ezekiel Duran on this roster. I'm just projecting how I think it's going to start. Maybe Duran ends up winning the job out of camp, and the Rangers are like, okay, well, we don't really need to go get a left fielder because they're banking on him taking that job. Or if I had my ideal scenario, I'd probably put Josh Young either in left field and put Ezekiel Duran on this roster and start him every day at third base, because I think he could be above average there at third base, and that would give the Rangers a lot of value there, and I think he can hit pretty well. Better than most of these bench options, if not all of these bench options. Obviously, he's got a little bit more in the tank offensively than Josh Smith. Having a Rangers roster where the backup middle infielder isn't just Charlie Culberson, no disrespect to the man, but having someone who's a little bit better, I think, offensively than him in Josh Smith is going to be a really, really nice upgrade to have. I really, really like Mark Mathias. I think the Rangers do. And having him with his versatility of playing second, third, corner outfield, first base if they need him to, and providing a decent amount of offensive value for a guy coming off the bench, had a really, really nice season. I think that is a good place to be. Now, the Sam Huff inclusion, it kind of depends on the health of Mitch Garver, as do a lot of things, and how he progresses. Maybe he doesn't make the opening day roster. Maybe they get some other. I really don't like the idea of carrying just a third, going and getting a backup catcher when theoretically your starting catcher should be Mitch Garver and Jonah Heim should be the backup. And if you are just getting a guy to be the backup because you're already banking on Garver not playing very much at all, or just softening the workload on Jonah Heim, then I think that's not great. But having those two guys split time, I think is the ideal scenario for the Rangers at catcher. Coming up, we're going to look at where the Rangers most need improvement and how they compare to some of the other teams that made the playoffs last year. But first, this episode is brought to you by BetOnline.net. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. From football to basketball to soccer and esports, we have got it all at betonline.net. And if you love sports podcasts, you can find those at BetOnline as well. We are always the fastest and easiest way to get in your betting fix. If you're wanting to make some bets on the Cowboys to finish out strong and catch the Eagles in that division, I think they've got lines for that. If you're just feeling good about how they're going to do next week or some other Dallas team, I don't think they have a lot of baseball lines up right now, but I'm thinking this preview might give you a little bit of a leaning as to where you should place your money. If you want to get your betting fix, it is the fastest and easiest way to get that in. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more, because BetOnline, it's where the game starts. Now, I think I've indicated this for a while, but it feels like left field is the biggest, easiest spot for the Rangers to go and get an upgrade there. There are quite a few really good options. I think they're pretty much out on any of these top guys at the top end of the market. Brandon Nimmo went back to the Mets, so that's not happening. Also, Kodai Senga signed a deal with the Mets. I've heard a lot of questions about that for, I believe it was 5 years and averaging $15 million, so 75, maybe it was 85, I think it was $75 million, and why the Rangers couldn't do that. I don't think it's that the Rangers couldn't. I think it's just a Kodai Senga preference. He had said that he wants to pitch somewhere on a contender pretty much immediately, and while I think the Rangers as currently constructed, are definitely fighting for that wild card. The Mets are coming off a 100-win season. They just added a whole bunch of talent, spent a whole bunch of money to not bring back Jacob deGrom, which I think is hilarious, and whatever. We'll get into that, I'm sure, a whole lot more during this offseason, but I don't think it's the Rangers couldn't. I think it was just Senga wanted a team that was better at the moment than the Rangers. He's going to be 30 next year, doesn't have a whole lot of time in Major League Baseball before the end of his pitching career, so he wanted to win as quickly as possible, and totally get that, totally respect that. Would have really loved to see him here, but that's not happening for the Rangers. Anyway, left field is the basic, obvious answer. I think the rotation is pretty much set. When you have Dane Dunning pushed out of the rotation and currently sitting at your number 6 starter, maybe he could fight and kick Jake Odorizzi out of the rotation, but I don't think at the moment that's really going to happen. But it's nice to have him there for depth. He'll probably start the year in AAA once he gets fully healthy from that offseason hip surgery. But the next place is the bullpen. Obviously, the starting rotation is fine. It would be there is a potential for a big upgrade in there. I would like for the Rangers to get a clear number 2 starter. If Martin Perez is exactly who he was last year, then that's solid. That is a number 2 starter you can feel good about, and that is a guy you can pitch with confidence in game 2 of a playoff series and say, yeah, we feel good with this guy on the hill, and we think he's going to go out there and kick butt and be consistent. I don't know if that's who he is. I think that would be great, but I don't know, and I don't think the Rangers do either. Otherwise, he wouldn't have gotten the qualifying offer. He would have just signed a contract extension. If the Rangers thought this is exactly who he is, they would know better than I do, and they would know better than pretty much anyone else because they saw him every day. They they know exactly what he is. But I think that there is a potential for another top end guy who is, the difference between the number 1, 2, and 3 starters are 1 and 2 is kind of the most fine. For me, a true number 1 starter on a playoff team is an ace, a guy who is constantly finishing in the top 5 of Cy Young voting and always, going out there every day, giving you 6+ innings, and a quality start is the baseline for what is expected of them. And a lot of times they'll go out 7 innings and have those 10, 12 strikeout games where they pitch 7 shutout innings and put up those crazy, insane numbers. But a number 2, that's kind of harder to define. I think it's a guy whose upside is having those same kind of days more frequently, but when they get into trouble, usually they can't do it as well as the number 1s. That's kind of what separates the number 2s from the number 3s. Number 3s, they'll go out there and they'll have their pretty good days. They'll also have some blow-up starts where they'll go like 5 innings and give up 5 runs. But they'll get you the 5. But you won't always feel good about it. And they'll also have some days where they'll go out there and pitch 7 shutout innings. You're like, okay, great. But it's not going to be a consistent thing. It's more just about the consistency. How often are you having good starts? And how well are you able to pitch on days when your stuff is not there? So I think that's kind of why I lean towards John Gray and Martin Perez both being number 3s, because that's kind of what John Gray was last year. Martin Perez last year was a number 2, and if he is that again, that's who he is. But John Gray, he had that 2-month stretch where he was fantastic and he was really darn good every time out, but you couldn't really count on that for the entire season long. He had a stretch where he missed 8 weeks, I think. Also missed a decent chunk of time early on in the season. He had a few games where he did get blown up when he was not able to pitch through it quite as well when his stuff wasn't working. And so I think that's kind of where he is. But he's a pretty good number 3. He has potential to be number 2, but it's a lot of it feels like it centers around his health. Now, Jake Odorizzi, that's a number 5. He's going to get you 4 to 5 innings every time out, and usually you'll still be in. You won't have too many just blow up starts where he goes 2 innings and gives up 7 runs. He'll have the occasional one, but for the most part, he'll be solid in that. And Heaney, I think, kind of fits in that number 4 role where it's like it kind of reminds me of the Derek Holland. That's who I think of as a number 4 starter on a playoff caliber team. Guys who once every 7, 8, 10 starts, they'll have just an absolutely phenomenal outing. Like Like think of Derek Holland in that World Series game 4, I think it was. Maybe it was game 3, where he just went out and threw 8 1/3 shutout innings, just absolutely dominated the Cardinals. Was just so incredibly good. One of the best games that honestly any Rangers pitcher has ever pitched. But for those other times, he'll have a lot of blow up starts. He'll not be able to go consistently 6-ish innings. He'll have a lot more of those blow up starts than he will of the good starts, and he'll have a lot of mediocre starts where he goes like 5 and gives up 2 or 3, and you're like, okay, that's fine. You kept us in it. You did okay, but you weren't. You'll always be longing for that 7th, 8th start where he just absolutely dominates. So I think the Rangers kind of have that sort of ideal, and a lot of it depends around that ideal playoff-ish rotation. I mean, actually, in an ideal world, you just have two aces, and then your third pitcher is a number 2, and you don't even have a number 5 in your rotation. That's the ideal. That's not what the Rangers have, but they do have 4 solid starters and a 5th guy who's going to be pretty decent as well. And I think that's the bare minimum for what you want as a starting rotation. And then they also have a backup number 5 in Dane Dunning. So I like that. But the bullpen, we'll get into a little bit of the bullpen and kind of take a look at these other teams and where the Rangers stack up with them. But first, this episode is brought to you by Simply Safe. At Locked On Rangers, we believe home security should be you. Home is where you and your family should feel safest, especially over the holidays. This season, give yourself and your family the gift of peace and protection with the #1 rated home security system. It's Simply Safe. And right now, Simply Safe is offering Locked On Rangers listeners 40% off a new security system. But don't put this off. Here is why you'll love it. In an emergency, 24/7 professional monitoring agents use Fast Protect technology exclusively from Simply Safe to capture critical evidence and verify the threat is real so you can get a higher priority police response. Don't miss your chance to save big on my favorite security system. Get 40% off any new system at simplysafe.com/lockedonmlb today. That's simplysafe.com/lockedonmlb. There's no safe like Simply Safe. Now, let's take a look at the Rangers' competition for this number 3 wild card spot. I think number 1 wild card spot is probably going to go to the Mariners or the Blue Jays. I'm leaning more towards the Mariners because it felt like they were a lot more aggressive this offseason. Them and the Blue Jays, I believe, had a pretty similar record. The Blue Jays were a 92-win team. The Mariners were a 90-win team. I think the regression or the positive regression or whatever of the Mariners having Luis Castillo for an entire season as opposed to just half a season is going to be really darn good. They have a bunch of young starters who are just getting better in Logan Gilbert and George Kirby. They also have some young stars like Cal Raleigh is pretty darn young. They also have Julio Rodriguez. Obviously, they lost Mitch Haniger, but they replaced him with Teoscar Hernandez, who I think is going to be really darn good. Not sure what they're going to do in left field since they traded Jesse Winker, but they got a big upgrade in Colton Wong at second base. So I think this team is pretty set and pretty darn good to go. Eugenio Suarez had a fantastic year last year, so I think this is still a 90-ish win team. I'm hoping that they push the Astros for the AL West, but I'm not sure they're quite there yet. They've got a really darn good bullpen, and I just don't think that the Rangers, as currently constructed, or really unless they get a lot of help, I think the rotation at the back end is kind of close. The top end, obviously the Rangers have the best starter in the American League and all of baseball. But once you get to 2 through 4, I think the Mariners are a little bit deeper. Their bullpen is a little bit deeper. Their lineup, I think the Rangers are kind of a push. I think the Rangers have better top-end talent at the top of their lineup than the Mariners do. But when you get to depth in the 7, 8, 9 spots, I think the Mariners might have just a little bit of an edge there. Let's look at the Blue Jays, who made some interesting moves this offseason. They still have a really, really solid rotation with Alek Manoah, Kevin Gossman, Jose Barrios, who had a really terrible year, but I still think is a really good pitcher. Their bullpen is really hit and miss. Jordan Romano, David Phelps, and Tim Maiza were all pretty darn good for them last year, as was Adam Simber. Their lineup, obviously at the top end, is just fantastic. They have Matt Chapman, who was hitting like 7th for them last year, which is kind of insane. But they also have Vladimir Guerrero Jr., George Springer. It's just a really, really good lineup, and also Bo Bichette as well. And also Alejandro Kirk, who was really darn good last year as well. A lot of catching depth for them. I think the Rangers aren't quite as good as them. I didn't love them trading Teoscar Hernandez for a reliever, even if he has been pretty good this year. I didn't really get it, and I thought they should have kept him. But that's neither here nor there. I think the Rangers are still a little bit behind them. Now let's look at the next competition, the third spot in this wild card this season. It was the Tampa Bay Rays. Now, pitching staff wise, well, not a whole lot of people are competing with this Rays staff. They have Shane McClanahan at the top of their staff, and he's as close to, I think, just about anyone in the American League for challenging Jacob deGrom for being the best starter. He has also had some injuries this year, only pitched 166 innings, did make 28 starts, but the Rays are very, very careful with their starting pitchers. They also had Corey Kluber, who I think is still a free agent, hasn't signed anywhere yet. They also had Drew Rasmussen and former Ranger great Jeffrey Springs, who were both really solid. Both of those last two guys had a sub-3 ERA and started 28 and 30 and 25 games respectively, through 135 and 146 innings. But again, the Rays are always going to be really great at developing pitching. You look at their lineup, their bullpen, obviously, it's a Rays bullpen. It's really darn good. It's going to be really good next year. You're not going to know anybody in it, but they're still going to be absolutely fantastic no matter who they lost. But their offense was honestly terrible last year. It was just straight up terrible. Yandy Diaz was their best hitter, and I don't think it was particularly close. He had an 824 OPS. Nobody else in their entire team had an 800 plus OPS. Not a whole lot of their starters even had a 700 plus OPS. Harold Reynolds was fine for them as a DH. Manuel Margot was okay. Randy Arozarena had a 773 OPS season with 20 bombs, led their team, as well as Isaac Paredes. But Wander Franco was hurt for most of the season, an 83 game span where he was pretty good, but his replacement Taylor Walls was just horrible offensively. I think their offense will get just a little bit better next year, just some regression to the mean. They've got some good players. They did lose Kevin Kiermaier, so I'm curious as to how they're going to fill that spot in the outfield. But I think their offense being so bad, it's not going to be good next year. I don't think it'll be this terrible. They just have too many guys that are talented. Brandon Lau is pretty darn talented. Diaz was fine. Rosarena had a fine season. Margot was fine. And just adding Franco back, I think will be a huge, huge boom for them. But still, I think the Rangers have a significantly better lineup than them. Starting pitching wise and bullpen, well, it's gonna give the edge to the Rays. But I think the Rangers' edge offensively is going to be a lot bigger over the Rays than the Rays' edge pitching wise over the Rangers, if that makes any sense. So I think that's where the Rangers are going to pass. If they're going to pass a team, it's going to be a team like this. The Red Sox lost Sander Bogarts, so I'm not really counting them in the mix for any of this. Maybe there'll be some regression from the Yankees, and it'll be the Blue Jays that are winning it all. But let's look at some of the other competition that I think will be pretty close to where the Rangers are next year. It'll be the White Sox, who have a really, really good team that is just constantly underperformed. And I think not having that fossil of a man managing them next year will inject some new life into this team. Tim Anderson is a really good player. They lost Jose Abreu because they just decided not to pay him. Yasmani Grandal was one of the worst hitters in baseball this past year. I don't think that's going to continue. I really don't. Yohan Moncada also had a just terrible season. Luis Robert had a really bad season for him. I think they bounced back just a little bit. Maybe they sign Elvis to play third. He had a really nice stint while he was with them and hit for, well, more power in that sample size than he had pretty much ever in his career. 9 home runs in 43 games. I don't know if they'll necessarily bring him back, but I think it would definitely be a nice look for them and maybe move him to second base. The top of their rotation is fantastic in Dillis Cease, but their number 2, Lucas Giolito, had a honestly terrible year. Their bullpen was really hit and miss. Liam Hendricks and Reynaldo Lopez were really darn good in the back end. Kendall Graveman was pretty solid, but outside of that, there was a lot of poor relievers for them. The back end of the rotation had some moments. Johnny Cueto really did well for them when they desperately needed it. Lance Lynn was hurt last year and only pitched in 21 games, 121 innings, and a 3.99 ERA. Michael Kopech was solid, made 25 starts, but only pitched 119 innings. He was one of the guys who I was thinking of when I think of White Sox starters who rack up Ks like crazy, but don't necessarily pitch super deep into games. So I think there'll be some progression from them. But I don't think the Rangers are going to finish behind the White Sox or with a worse record than the White Sox, or just in general be a worse team than the White Sox next year, which is a darn shame because there's a lot of those really good players who deserve to be on a good team, and they should have been one of the more aggressive teams in free agency. They probably should bring back Carlos Rodon, but their ownership isn't going to spend money, and that's a shame. But it sucks to be a poor team. Glad the Rangers aren't, and I'm very glad the Rangers are. But I think the next competition that the Rangers will be fighting with is the Baltimore Orioles, who had a really scrappy and fun season this year. Handed the Rangers a sweep. I think one of the more brutal series that I've watched of Rangers baseball. A 3 straight 1-run losses where the Rangers had leads in all of them was just honestly miserable. And that's what in the middle of their 17 or it felt like 30 game winning streak. I think it ended up being around 18 or 19, but they were a really scrappy, fun young team. They will be getting back their best pitcher who missed most of last season in Means. I think it's John Means. Yeah. And they also had Dean Kramer, who was pretty solid. Jordan Lyles was their innings eater. They have a bunch of young talent that is coming. They have a bunch of young talent that is there. One of those guys is Gunnar Henderson, who had a really solid 34-game sample size when he came up towards the end of the year. Adley Rutschman finished in second in Rookie of the Year voting. Could have won it in a normal year. Had a fantastic season. 800-plus OPS as a catcher who is a defensive wizard. They had Cedric Mullins being pretty good, Jorge Mateo being pretty darn good, Ryan Mountcastle and Anthony Santander all contributing, as well as Austin Hayes offensively. They're a solid team. I think they're going to give a lot of people a lot of problems next year. And had they been aggressive in free agency, and they have more than enough room on their payroll to go and sign Carlos Rodon to the kind of deal that he's looking for, 6 years, somewhere in the $200 million range, and also sign Carlos Correa for a crap ton of money to go be a star, capital S star. We saw how much they loved him in Minnesota, and I think that would have been a really smart move because their payroll is just so insanely low, and then make room for some of their top-end prospects that are still coming up and still going to contribute in a big way next year. I don't think they're going to do that, which is a darn shame, but I still think they're going to be scrappy. I don't think they're quite good enough next year to win a wild card spot. I think the Rangers will have a better record than them. They did finish with a winning record this year, which is great. 83 wins in a very tough division is really impressive and a testament to how well they have built their team and turned around that rebuild really quickly. The Rangers hoping to rebuild even quicker and end their drought faster than the Baltimore Orioles and their playoff drought. But all in all, I think the Rangers are at present an 85-ish win team. I think that should be good enough for them to contend for the playoffs, if not make a playoff spot. I think there are right now, well, it doesn't really matter about the Central. Whoever wins the Central is going to have like an 85 win season and be like just fine and just good enough to win that division. But I think right now the Astros are categorically ahead of the Rangers. I think the Mariners are also significantly ahead of the Rangers, the Blue Jays as well, and the Yankees probably too. I can't tell what the Yankees are going to do. Honestly, no idea. Just such a mystery. I predicted them to finish last in the division last year, and look how that turned out. But I think this Rangers team is in that kind of next tier with the Rays and the White Sox and the Orioles and whoever else is kind of in that range. Maybe they'll even finish with a better record than the Blue Jays because they decided to trade off some pieces. I don't think so. I think that Blue Jays team is really darn solid. And Vladimir Guerrero Jr., who had a bad year, still had an 820-ish OPS, which is insane. But I do think that this team is good enough to compete for a playoff spot if they want to pretty much guarantee themselves, put themselves into the next tier. I think adding a top-end starting pitcher and adding a really darn good left fielder is a great way to add that value and maybe one bullpen piece. I'll get into a little bit closer of a look at the bullpen later this week, and also a look at what happens if Jacob deGrom is healthy and how that changes absolutely everything. But that's going to do it for this edition of Locked On Rangers. Thank y'all so much for listening and subscribing, and until next time, don't forget to enjoy baseball.